Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock. This is Starfleet Tactical. As you can see, I am by myself, except I do have Lissa producing the show behind the scenes. So, Lissa, are you going to jump in for just a second and wave to the crowd?
Hi.
So, I was telling Lissa earlier that I actually saw Pat this week. Pat and I both went to a funeral. So I got to pick him up at the Cleveland airport at 11:30 at night and then get up the next morning and go to a funeral and stuff. So it was good seeing him. I wish it was for a better reason than, I wish it was for a happier reason, let's put it that way, than going to a funeral. But he is unable to make it tonight. So I am here solo by myself with Lissa's assistance as always. Let's see, there was something else I was going to say about that. What was it? I can't remember, but if it comes to me, I'll say it later. So I decided that, as I sat back and thought about what I talked about last week, and I listened to the show again, because I always listen to the show before the next one comes up, or at least I try to. And I go back and I hear all the stuff that I said that it's like where I misspoke, where I used one word when I meant another word or something like that. But while listening to the show, I kept coming up with oh, I wish I had said X. Oh, I wish I had said Y. Oh, I wish I had said this other thing. And so I finally said, why don't I go ahead and say those things? Why don't I go ahead and just do another show on CICs, et cetera, and sort of expand on it? At some point, I'd like to take it and sort of make it into a nicer, cleaner presentation. Pat and I actually have plans to start doing that with some of the stuff that we've done after we sort of run it through a couple of times. It always helps to do it in front of an audience. So after I've run it through a couple of times and I've sort of got it down what I want to say, then we're probably going to start re-recording some of that stuff with actual scripts so that it sounds... So it's not just me speaking extemporaneously with all the ums and et cetera, that I throw in for flavoring. But in the meantime, though, I decided I'd go ahead and do that. So let me go ahead and start the presentation. And so as always, it's my opinions, not my employer's. No employer, past, present, or presumably future. I'm still behind in my comments. I've been meaning to go back and look through the comments and put them up, and I just haven't gotten that done. So my apologies. Anybody who's there waiting for me to get to the comments, I just haven't gotten to it yet. Next week, remember how I told you last time that Pat and I are thinking about ways that we could sort of change the format just a little bit, so it's not just us always talking, to bring in some other things. So next week, Pat has talked with the guy behind the game Nebulous Fleet Command. It's available on Steam in its pre-release version. And Andy Presby's done some playing with it, and Pat's done some playing with it, and they both really, really like it. I haven't gone hands-on with it yet. I hope to have the opportunity to at least read a bunch of the dev videos that he's done for it. But there's a lot of videos on YouTube about this game. It's very well done from what I've seen, and Pat's talked with the guy, and he's going to come and talk to us. And he is, I'm pretty sure he says this in public, so it's okay for me to say it, that he's a serving naval officer. So he also is somebody who has some experience in this sort of thing. And so he's coming at it from a viewpoint of experience. So he's going to be the guest next week. And I'm really looking forward to that, even though it means I've got a lot of time between now and then to sort of get my act together and get smart on Nebulous Fleet Command. So, like I said, I'm going to do Bridges and Combat Information Centers Take 2. The way I'm going to do... sorry. Oh. Okay. Got all sorts of problems. I accidentally skipped ahead. Went to the very end. Let's go back to the beginning. Okay, so the plan for tonight, I'm going to go through a bunch of the slides I did last week and give you like the 10-second version on each slide just so that we're all on the same page. I'm going to expand on a few things, including talking about submarines a little bit. The reason why I'm going to talk about submarines is that I realized, I'd done this comparison between how Star Trek does things and how surface ships do things, and about how in the surface ships you've got the Combat Information Center and you've got the bridge as a separate thing, etc. And I realized that a much better analogy is actually the submarine world, because in the submarine world, when they're submerged, all of the warfare functions really sort of take place in the same room, just like in Star Trek. So let's talk about submarines a little bit and how they do stuff. And I'm going to show you some other CICs that I found. But first, I'm going to do a little minor correction to something I said last week. But even before that, it's worth going and looking at a few of the caveats that I've got. So in addition to the I don't speak for my employer, there is the caveat that I am not a veteran of the United States Navy, or any other Navy for that matter. I was a civilian naval analyst. So I spent 10 years working very closely with 5 years, 6 years working very closely with operating forces. I would go out to sea with them and I'd watch them in their native environment. I then spent another 5 years at the Naval War College having follow-up conversations with all of my fellow faculty members who were all operators of one sort or another. Then I went off to be a naval intel analyst, where I spent a lot of time with Navy folks, but I wasn't actually seeing any of that stuff. But at no time was I ever actually in the Navy. So I saw a lot of people doing their thing in a particular time period. That time period was November 1999 through November 2004. So for that 5 years, I spent a lot of time at sea watching them do their thing, but it was a particular time period. It was the perspective of somebody who on the outside who was looking in, able to ask questions, but I wasn't there as somebody who had been raised through the entire system. So please keep that in mind. So if one of the folks on like Wright or Scott Voigt, who we haven't seen in a while, or anybody else comes and says, hey, that's not my experience, then you should listen to them. The only thing I would add is their experience also comes in a particular time frame. And, there are times where I've had people say, oh, you're wrong about that. Well, back in 1975, when he was going to sea, what he said was true, but the world has changed since then. And, my experience 25 years later was different. So, keep in mind, it's always important to keep in mind when somebody's experience was and exactly what type of experience they had at the time. So that's the caveat. The other caveat I'd add is that I never spent any underway time on submarines. I've toured more submarines than I can remember, but they were all just port side, pier side. They're not doing anything at the time. So I've never been underway on a submarine, with the exception of a tourist submarine in Hawaii, which was actually pretty cool. Okay, so let's see. There we go. So this is a slide that I showed you last week. We'll go through it real quick. Remember that the bridge, or as they call the pilot house, is a navigation and ship control function. That's where you steer the ship. The Combat Information Center on a destroyer or a cruiser or a frigate is where you fight the ship from. It's the command and control location. It's got the tactical action officer. That's where the CO goes when it's time for battle stations. And on a aircraft carrier, that's called the Combat Direction Center, and it's one of a couple of spaces there. The Combat Direction Center has one part of it that is about ship self-protection. Then it's got another part that's about surface warfare and a third part that's about undersea warfare. I did not mention the last time that there's also another command space called the Tactical Flag Command Center, which is where the admiral and his staff hang out. And they're monitoring the situation, and they generally keep their mouth shut. The admiral has promulgated his intent, and then he and his staff just sort of monitor things to make sure that everything is going the way they want. Their job is to sort of stand back and not get involved in the minutia of the details and sort of maintain their perspective and keeping a look at all the pictures. Everybody else is focused on their little piece of it. They're the guys that sort of stand back and look at the whole thing. All right, so I showed you this illustration of the bridge of a DDG 51. There's some stuff missing on it, like there's like the radar guy. You see the guy sitting there. He's at a radar screen. That's not shown, but that's generally what that layout looks like. And now we're going to get to that minor correction that I talked about. So the minor correction was specifically when I was talking about the activity on the bridge, and I was talking about what the officer of the deck does, the OOD, the conning officer, and the helm. And the example the verbal example I gave had the conning officer simply repeating what the officer of the deck said to the helm. That's wrong. The officer of the deck expresses an intent, like come to course 030 at 20 knots. The conning officer takes that intent and translates into explicit stick and rudder type, movements. So come to course 030 at 20 knots. The conning officer will say something like helm, right standard rudder, make revolutions for 20 knots. So he tells them exactly how to position the rudder, and when they get through the turn, the conning officer will be paying attention, and he'll tell them to come, rudder amidships or whatever. I forget the exact phrase, that they'll move the rudder back to straight to straighten out that turn. So the helm is not making decisions on when to turn. He's implementing that, but he's not making decisions. There's also the make revolutions for 20 knots. Why would you say it that way? Well, the reason why is because that the number of the revolutions of the propeller, it actually changes based upon your speed. So it's a variable pitch propeller, and because of drag, et cetera, at higher speeds, you need more revolutions per knot to make it work. And so they've got a little chart, and they just sort of look it up, and it's like, okay, if we want to go, it's just posted right there. If we want to go 19 knots, I need to set the throttle for this. And so that's how they do that. And then, the helm will respond with aye, sir. And I can't remember if they repeat it back or not. In the surface Navy, they repeat stuff back sometimes. In the submarine force, they repeat stuff back all the time. That's another thing that's kind of interesting, is that their procedures actually are different for the undersea force versus the surface force. And also, it's worth noting, all that stuff is standardized. They don't make up ways to say things. They always say it in very, very explicit ways. You are exactly specific, and the words that you use to describe this stuff are explicitly written out in the book, right? There is a manual. You learn how to do it. It's called a litany, and the litany always works the same way, and you've got a controlled vocabulary. Like for submarines, a torpedo is something that the bad guy shoots at you. Your device is known as a unit. And so just by virtue of the fact, whether you say unit or you say torpedo, everybody is clear on exactly what you're referring to. And so the surface force has their own little standardizations on that too. I think I've said once before that when I read Scott Geyer's Ganellan series, one of the things that I noticed right away is that every time they do certain actions, they always do them exactly the same way, including the calls they make over the radio. And that's very, very authentic. And it turns out he was a naval aviator. It's very authentic that you would do that sort of stuff. Always do it in the same way if you're doing the same procedure. So the cartoon on the lower right, that's from a guy named Jeff Bacon. He does a thing called Broadsides, a strip called Broadsides. Jeff was, I've never met him. I would have loved to have met him. He's been retired for a while now, but he was a serving naval officer. I know of at least one of my friends actually ran into him on an exercise. And his stuff is fantastic, and it's a really good view of Navy life. Okay, so You saw this the last time. The thing I would note is that I talk about the 5 functions of, or people will talk about the 5 functions of CIC that are all about collecting data and disseminating it, etc. But this is a warfare command space, and people are actually shooting weapons from it. And that's not officially listed in the 5 functions of the CIC, but one of those functions is to actually fire weapons and be prepared to fire weapons and firing weapons. So it's more than just information. It's the combat part of the Combat Information Center. This is the CG-47 class. As you can see, a much different layout. It's got a little bit more capability in that it's got 2 of the big displays up front rather than just 1. So this is one that's new. This is the DLG 28 class, the USS Wainwright class. Now, it's also worth pointing out that all of these things are sort of a snapshot over time. This was good for a particular time. Like if you go back to this one, if you look at table number 2 to the right of position number 2, there's a piece of gear there. Well, I've never actually seen that piece of gear because by the time I started going aboard Arleigh Burke's, that piece of gear had been removed. And if you looked at the raised floor down below, there was a floor panel that was exactly the size and shape of that piece of gear. So they had taken something out. I think it was some sort of inertial tracking system. They had taken it out. And so, CICs change over time. I understand that they're remodeling the CICs on the DDG-51 class, but I haven't seen it yet. All right, so back to this Wainwright one. You'll notice one of the things that immediately comes to my mind, the first thing you notice is that it's right off the bridge. The captain can go out on the bridge. He can walk through a passageway and get back into CIC right away. That means 2 things. It means, first of all, officers can go back and forth, if they can go back to get situational awareness, etc. This makes a lot of sense. Remember what I said about how early on the captains wanted to command from the bridge? This lets them have their cake and eat it too. They can still say that they're close to the bridge. The other thing it does, though, is that it puts the CIC in sort of an exposed position. Because it's in the superstructure of the ship, it's up relatively high. If a missile comes in, it can take out the entire CIC. Whereas like in an Arleigh Burke, it's actually fairly down low in the ship. It's not quite below the water line, but it's in the main body of the ship, and there's a lot more protection down there. And, if you go back to the CG-47 class right there, that's 1 or 2 levels down from the bridge. So you could still get the captain or whoever could get to and from the bridge quite easily. But they decided they wanted to, when the DDG-51, they wanted to make it a little bit farther away. I've always thought that the bridge on a Federation starship is dangerously exposed. I do not understand why you would stick it up there on top. All that stuff about it being a module that you can pull out, etc. I mean, in an era of transporters and all the rest, I don't understand why that ability to sort of unplug the module is that big a deal, right? I mean, you still have to, presumably, whenever they redo the module up there, when they're upgrading systems, etc., they have to upgrade the systems on the battle bridge or whatever auxiliary control is. They might as well just do stuff like that. I really have never understood why they stick it in such an exposed position. Okay, so this is the Zumwalt class, the super DDGs that are huge, and I look at this and I don't I haven't had a very good rundown of exactly who's where and how they're organized. But the very first thing I see here is something that I've seen in lots of different command spaces. And that is, they put these big screens on the wall, but they're nowhere near big enough. If you're anywhere sitting back and you got to see those screens, you can't really see a whole lot in that because the screen just isn't big enough. I also, I don't understand why they have what they would be putting up on the screen that they need to have everybody sort of oriented in the same position. I like some of these other designs better in terms of it all being about communication and information flow. It shouldn't be about everybody in CIC gets a chance to look at the big screen, because that doesn't make any sense. I'll also note, this is a layout that you very, very, very frequently see in land-based control centers. This is exactly the sort of thing that the fleet operations centers look like. There's usually a balcony. There's usually big screens on the wall, a bunch of stuff facing in that direction, and then you might have festival seating, sort of, or like bleacher seating. Not bleacher, stadium seating. That's what I'm trying to say. In the balcony, sort of looking on, and that's where the admiral would go, and he'd get a briefing, and he's being briefed by somebody down on the floor who's talking to the admiral up there. And that way, the staff can the flag staff can sort of come in and overlook things without actually showing up on the floor and disturbing them. So this was a Japanese frigate CIC that we talked about. But one of the things I didn't point out on this is that, this really does look a lot like, conceptually like an old style Federation starship bridge, right? You've got a lot of guys around the outside that are facing out. You've got big screens over the top, designed to present information in such a way that the command staff can sort of, go around the room and see whatever they need to see for any particular piece of information. Those screens are much bigger, relatively speaking, than those screens are. Those are tiny because that's such a huge room. This is a much smaller room, and you can probably see everything pretty well from like the center area, which is where I imagine the command staff is. So that strikes me as being a pretty nifty layout. I hope to hell it's not all white like that, because that would be very glaring. And that's usually not how they do that. Usually spaces like that are kind of dark, and they have a tendency, everything ends up being gray, except the walls are black, because you don't want light reflecting into your eyes off the walls. It's sort of interesting. You can tell what kind of space you're in just by looking at the color of the walls on a US Navy surface ship. Because some walls are lightly colored and some walls are darkly colored. Living spaces are usually lightly colored. Okay. Let's see. So we talked about this the last time. This is the original Star Trek bridge, and a modified, another class of starship and its modification as it went from original era to movie era. The Next Generation bridge. Now, this is actually, I'm going to stop here for just a second, because we didn't really talk about the difference between this kind of bridge and this kind of bridge. So if you go back here, you'll see that the two positions are helm and navigation, right? So you've got a helmsman who's actually steering, and you've got a navigator who's telling him where to go. If you come down here, 17 and 18 are not helm and navigation. It's either called helm or con. I can't remember. That's Wesley. And then data in position 18 was ops. And they've got a much different model for how they're operating things. So basically, helm is doing all the navigation and flight control stuff. And ops is basically the systems manager in charge of everything else. So ops is responsible for prioritizing sensor packages, and basically all the deconfliction of stuff that happens during the operation of a Federation starship. Helm is steering and navigating. Ops is doing everything else, and so the two of them can sort of make everything happen. And that's a much different approach than what we see in the previous older versions of the Enterprise. And that's especially interesting because that's the approach. We're going to talk about that approach again when I get to the submarine section. Okay, the Voyager bridge, just say no, it's just wrong. Okay, so now let's talk about submarines for a little bit. This is the bridge of a Los Angeles class submarine. These are illustrations that specifically came out from the time period when the USS Greenville hit. When it was surfacing off the coast of Hawaii, it hit a Japanese research ship, educational ship. There were students on board. It was a teaching vessel of some sort. It hit it and sank it. It was a much smaller ship than the USS Greenville. Now, I had been on Greenville about 6 months before that happened. I met the CO who lost his job because that happened. He was, I spent 10 minutes talking to him in his stateroom because he had some things he wanted to pass on to us about what he thought about the exercise. And so I was there with another CNA guy, and we went to pick up some data from the submarine, and they said, "Can you come back sometime later this week? The CO would really like to talk to you." So I got a chance to actually meet him before that all happened. Now, as you can see, what you've got where it says ship control panel, upper right-hand corner is all about the making the ship go places. So in the upper right-hand corner, you've got the two planesmen, because there's two sets of planes, and they also control the rudder. You've got the diving officer of the watch, and there's also the ballast control panel over there where they change the where they adjust the trim of the ship and they blow air into the ballast tanks, et cetera, et cetera. That little cluster there is responsible for making the ship move in whatever way it needs to move. The officer of the deck sort of stands back. He's on the conning station, and there's a couple of scopes there. One of the scopes is bigger than the other one and has more capability, but the attack scope is a lot smaller. It has a smaller radar cross section, and just harder to see. It's just not quite as good as the main scope. And then in the upper right-hand corner, or lower right-hand corner of this illustration, I always think of it as upper right-hand corner because normally this would be rotated. In fact, I could have rotated it. Probably should have rotated it 90 degrees. You've got the Sonar Shack, and so there's usually a curtain there that they can draw because they're staring at displays, and they might have a different light level than what you have in the other part of the room. And so they're doing the sonar thing in there. And then you've got all the fire control consoles behind them. And so that's the general layout. You'll notice it's not very big. You'll also notice that with all the civilians, they had a lot of people in there, but that's actually not unusual. It's not unusual on a Navy ship to have a lot of people in a pretty small space. That's approximately the size of the undersea warfare module on an Nimitz class aircraft carrier. It's maybe a little bit bigger. And I remember one time looking around, and there were 20, 25 people in the room because there was something going on. And when everybody came into that room to sort of watch during this exercise, you had people that were there who were specifically looking at how well their gear was doing because they had some special gear on board the carrier. You had other people that were there because they wanted to use the tactical plot there to make a decision, like the Commodore had come in. You can cram an awful lot of people into a pretty small space. On the left-hand side, you basically see that same space, but just sort of in 3 dimensions. All right, so that's it for the Los Angeles class. Oh, I should say, let's go back to the control center. You've got a guy who's in charge of the tail planes, a guy who's in charge of the forward planes. Either they're on the sail or they're on the nose, and they also control the rudder. One of those two guys controls the rudder. And the throttle is actually back in the engineering space. And so you've got the diving officer of the watch who's he's sort of the equivalent of the conning officer telling them what to do. And so you've got basically 2 helmsmen who are doing their thing. And that's how that happens. Now, you go to this, if you look at the skipjack on the left, that's pretty much the same general kind of layout, and that's a submarine that was designed in the 1950s. It's got the same general kind of layout in its control room. You go to the right, that's the Virginia class, which is what we're currently building. It's much different. So first of all, they don't have a separate sonar shack. They've taken all the sonar guys and moved them into the control room. They've also, you can see that they put the radio room right there. In a Los Angeles class, you have to go out the rear hatch, and there's a radio room like down the hallway. But in this, the radio room is like immediately off. And you can't tell from here, but up forward where you've got the two positions for controlling it, what you've got is one person who's in charge of basically steering the boat up and down, left, right. And you've got somebody else that's in charge of all the operator of the watch sort of stuff. They're a lot more senior than the people who are doing the equivalent function on the Los Angeles class. Those are the plainsmen and the helmsmen they're relatively junior folks, but on the Virginia class, they're actually senior enlisted, and they're making decisions, and they're generally functioning like a conning officer and ops. So if you read the description in the Star Trek Next Generation Tech Manual, they're describing nowadays how a Virginia class submarine works in terms of those two positions, more or less. The other thing is this control room is wider. So how are they able to make it wider? Well, part of it is, the secret to that is that they have what they call a photonic mast. If you go back, let's go back, right? So you can see in the Los Angeles class, the periscopes, they're physical tubes. They actually penetrate through the hull. They're telescoping tubes, but you've got some limitations on, you want to minimize that travel distance. And as a result, as you can see on the left from the curve there, you put the control room at the very top of the submarine, because that's where you need to put it, because you've got these periscopes. For the Virginia class, it's not a penetration. What the periscope is, a separate entity. It still extends up, but it's got a camera at the top. All the periscope functions are taking place on a video screen, which means you're no longer limited by where you put the periscopes as to where you can put the control room. So in a Virginia class, the control room is actually one level down. And as a result, it's on a wider part of the hull, and they could take a bunch of stuff that they had sort of staged separately and move it into the control room. It'll be interesting to see if they keep the sonar guys in the control room. I can see arguments in favor of that. I can see arguments against. I believe I heard the sonar guys weren't happy about being moved to the control room. But, as a general rule, people who have their own space are never happy when they lose their space. So I don't know. I haven't gotten an assessment as to whether that's actually working or not. Rob Davidoff says, the exposed bridge annoys me, and that apparently annoyed Probert too. Yeah, I absolutely hate it. I absolutely hate it. And it doesn't surprise me that he would be annoyed as well. Okay, so this is a concept for something that's being called a submarine CIC. And this in a lot of ways looks a lot more like something you'd see in a spacecraft. Now, Havelsan is a Turkish company. I am not aware that the Turks have ever built a submarine before. Maybe they have. I haven't heard about it. But this is their plan for building a submarine. The group on the left, or at least the control room, the people on the left are the helm and navigation group. So that's how they control the submarine, is those five guys on the left are people that are controlling it. The two folks next to them that are facing each other, if I remember correctly, they're weapons operators. On the right-hand side, you've got the engineering cluster. And so that's all the folks that are controlling the engines. I don't know if there's a reactor involved, but they're controlling all the engineering stuff, et cetera, et cetera. The captain is standing over a three-dimensional holographic display of some sort. And those screens above him, it's kind of hard to see from this angle, but it looks to be ship status stuff. There's a schematic of the submarine, and my guess is it's giving you information about which ballast tanks are being used, et cetera, et cetera. Not sure what's on the other side. If you look for Havelsan submarine CIC concept, On YouTube, you can find the video that this came out of. It's about 2.5 minutes long, and it's well worth looking at. Okay, another one, futuristic submarine design is this French design, and I should have pulled the thread a little bit more because there's more illustrations to show here. But what you've got is sort of a helm and a combat side. I think the folks on the right-hand side, you've got the table that's closest to us, and then you've got two pairs of chairs with their own displays. And if I remember correctly, the folks on the left are controlling the boat. They're basically helm and ops, con and ops. And the folks on the right are looking through the periscope. And then you've got sort of a big display up in front. Now, one of the things that I find very interesting from all of these new displays ideas is, that looks like it's a shot underwater. Submarine control rooms don't have windows. They don't have big screens that show you stuff like that. Submarines basically tool around mostly blind underwater. They know where they are. They're using sonar, passive sonar, to listen for other contacts, etc. But they're not looking out a window. They don't have some magic display that has a schematic up. They've got a plotting table that has that sort of information. And these days that plotting table might be electronic, but they don't have something that looks like a forward window. But we're seeing that sort of stuff creep into these futuristic designs. Incidentally, this actually goes back to something you've probably heard me say before, which is I've never understood what the big window, what the big view screen is useful for on the bridge of a starship anyway. As it's used, I mean, it's being used as a window. It's dark in space. You can't really see anything. Why are they doing that? It seems to me that it's at its most useful when they're actually communicating with somebody and they put the giant head that they're talking to on the screen. Other than that, I would think that what you would have is some sort of navigational data and some sort of schematic on where you're going, etc. Why you would just have a picture of stars going by you, I don't understand. That doesn't seem to give you any data. Now, had long conversations with Pat Doyle and Andy Presby about this. They are both of the opinion, and I agree with them, that it's not just camera feeds from the outside. It's sort of a computer-generated display that's trying to show them stuff. You see in one of the movies where Kirk is dealing with a cloaked ship, and there's sort of a distortion, and our interpretation is that's the computer not able to sort of resolve something, and so it's showing a distortion on the screen. My response to that, though, is like, I would expect to see in that situation, some sort of arrow, some sort of call out saying unable to resolve this or whatever. I would expect there to be, if it's not just a picture, I mean, it clearly isn't because they do magnification, etc. But I would expect to see words up on the screen. I would expect to see call outs. I would expect to see data being presented next to all those images. And we don't see anything like that. So I think it's kind of lame. Also, as bridge designs get bigger, I don't think the view screens are keeping pace, even though some of those view screens are pretty big. If you're sitting far away, that's pretty small. That's pretty small. Think about, you've got a medium-sized TV and you're sitting across a big living room from it. How much do you actually see? Okay, so Sequest DSV, as long as we're doing science fiction and submarines, I have yet to go aboard any United States submarine that had a dolphin access port anywhere on the submarine, let alone on the bridge. This bridge always struck me as being way too spacious for a submarine. On a submarine, space is really at a premium, and they just had, cathedral ceilings and the whole bit. It just did not strike me as being particularly useful, and too many steps. Steps are bad. Steps are just something that when the thing's rocking for whatever reason, like because you're on the surface or because it's at an angle because you're changing depth or something like that, that's just it's just a trip hazard. So I don't understand why they do that. But this is the best illustration I could find. This is actually a set design illustration. Okay, so I just grabbed a bunch of bridges. This is from Astra Scientia, where they just pulled it off their site. It's got a lot of illustrations of a lot of different bridges over time. As you can see, they all, you can sort of see the evolution. They start off with guys around the periphery, sort of facing outwards with a small number of people, including the commanding officer facing the bridge, the screen, I mean. Over time, during this entire era, that seems to be what their philosophy was. As you go through, you start seeing slightly different things, like the number of bridge crew seems to go down, first of all, or at least the number of bridge stations seems to go down. And they all start facing the screen together. So by the time you get to the 2360s and the 1701D, there seems to be a real premium on everybody facing the screens. Now, you do have those workstations in the back, but if you think about it, those workstations aren't about the normal operation of the ship. Usually those workstations are, they're workstations. If you've got a special problem, you go work on it there. And here's some more bridges, including a different version of the 1701D. And the Defiant Bridge is sort of back to everything being facing outwards, which is a nice touch. And then the Prometheus is that way as well. And so it's unclear to me as to whether there's any reason as to why they sort of changed their design philosophy. I don't get it. I don't understand why the philosophy changes over time like that. I'd love to see an in-universe rationale for that. I mean, we all know that it's really because it's a TV show and they did it to sort of make the TV show look cool. Okay, and here's even more. Okay, let's see. Is there anything? Nothing about those I really want to do a specific call out for. So, and that's what I had on bridges and CICs. I do want to go back to CICs for just a second, CICs and Star Trek for just a second, because as you recall, I mentioned last week that there's, in one of the movies, I think it is, there's a scene where they're clearly standing in front of something labeled Combat Information Center. Now, on a U.S. Navy ship, when you've got the Combat Information Center, you've got lots of people sitting in front of screens, and they're sort of processing individual pieces of the problem. For instance, you've got a lot of different radar displays, and you may have different people looking at different sections of the sky. They're focused on different things. Some of those people sitting at radar screens are functioning as aircraft controllers. Because you've got an airborne asset, a helicopter, a P3, maybe multiple airborne assets all operating in the same space. They're functioning as the air traffic control guy who's giving them instructions on what to do. And so you've got so some of the people are just there operating the radars for ship self-defense and for offensive operations, and they're looking at different pieces of the puzzle, and other folks are looking at are specifically controlling aircraft. It's worth pointing out that you've got multiple, it's all the same radars that they're all looking at. The display is separate from the radar. And so you can have, for a given radar, you can have one person looking at a display, and they've got it set so that they're only seeing like the inner 20 miles or something like that. And somebody else is looking out to 200 miles. Same radar, it's getting the same signal, they're just displaying it differently. And that's the same with those displays that are at the front of CIC, the big ones that the tactical action officer and his assistant are using to make combat decisions on. All that stuff is being, they're getting reports from all the folks that are doing the radar stuff, but that's how they maintain their situational awareness. Incidentally, the tactical action officer doesn't have a fire button. He doesn't do that. He gives orders to an enlisted guy and says, set it to auto special, or, take out this target, et cetera, et cetera. He's making the combat decisions, but he's not actually doing anything other than telling somebody else how to do it. So my buddy Andy Presby, when he was at sea, back when he was a submariner, he used to tell his people, gentlemen, you are on a marvel of modern engineering. This is a voice-activated submarine. You tell this to the officers. This is a voice-activated submarine. If I catch you touching anything other than the radio or the periscope, there will be hell to pay. It's not your job to touch the controls. The enlisted guys touch the controls. You give them orders. They touch the controls. So it makes me wonder what CIC would do on the Enterprise, because you've got an awful lot of automation there. I think that there's probably a role for humans or aliens, for actual crew members to process some information, to sort of run an analysis, et cetera. But I'm pretty sure it's not a bank of guys all looking at the same radar screen, right? I'm pretty sure that the computer is doing all the sensor fusion stuff. The computer is calling stuff out to the tactical officer. And a lot of that stuff is automated. So I really kind of wonder what CIC would do on that. Now, as a member of U9, we spent a lot of time, Andy Presby and I in particular spent a lot of time talking about what do CICs do in the Honorverse, because that also was a question. We very much knew that they were there. In the Honorverse, my working hypothesis was that they were feeding information up to the tactical officer who was on the bridge. Their model was very much that all the combat decisions were made on the bridge. The tactical officer is on the bridge, not down in CIC. That CIC really was about information, and it really was about feeding information up to the bridge officers, and they would act upon that information. And that might also include things like controlling sensor drones and running long-term analysis and things like that. But I think that when the tactical officer is making decisions, what they're doing is they're getting stuff, at a minimum, they're getting stuff that the computer has processed, but they're also getting recommendations from CIC. So I think that when they're setting up a fire plan, they've got presets, and they've got other information that's coming to them from CIC, and they're sort of going like, okay, based upon what I'm seeing, I'm going to select Bravo 1, Delta 4 as being our fire plan for this, and then they execute it. But we never really see a good scene in CIC. In fact, one of the things that I always wanted to do, I'm probably never going to get around to it, but one of the things I always wanted to do was pick an Honorverse battle where I know that they've been talking to CIC and sort of write that battle from the perspective of the folks in CIC to sort of try to help define exactly what those folks are doing. I think when it comes to Star Trek, since we don't ever actually see them talking to anybody, we see them stand in front of a door, but we never see anything there. I don't think anything's going on there. It might just be a computer room. Right? It might just be the combat information centers where there's a bunch of processor cores. I don't remember whether it's on any maps or anything, any schematics of any of the various 1701D plans. But I don't see what it does. So, and that would be really interesting to see what it does. All right, I'm going to look through comments real quick and see if there's any here that I want to respond to right now. Let's see. Okay, hello to everybody. All right. Yeah, right. My condolence on your loss. Been there, done that. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of my mother passing away, so it's getting, the first 4 months most of the first 4 months of last year were actually reasonably good for me, and then things sort of went south. Let's see, DDG 57, okay. Yeah, so Wright says that when he toured the DDG 57, he thought the layout was more efficient than the last of the cruisers. I I really, really like the DDG 51 layout. I really like that layout. I need to sit down and figure out whether the reason why I like that layout is I think it looks more like a Starship Bridge than the other one, because it clearly looks more like a Starship Bridge than the other one. But it seemed that the tactical action officer, instead of having everything behind him extending all the way back, everything, there was lots of stuff off to one side. And because it was physically a smaller space, he was able to sort of maintain situational awareness on everything else that was going on a little bit more. I'd also like to see the modification, because they've got new equipment, they've got more efficient monitors, they've sort of moved the big monitors back, and sort of moved a bunch of the warfare officers up front, and taken the raised floor out up front. But I've only had it described to me. I haven't actually seen it, so I don't know what it actually looks like and how I certainly haven't seen it in operation. So would like to see it in operation. Yeah, it looks like NORAD. It's so huge. Yeah, I mean that must have been a comment about the Zumwalt CIC. It's like I just look at that and go, "What are all those folks?" I mean, I guess some of the other ones you look at, there's that many people, but they just seem to be so spread out. Now, on the one hand, it's worth pointing out, if you could go back and look at those illustrations, that what you see in Star Trek is you see consoles that are built into the wall, right? In the real world, you don't want to build consoles into the wall because you might need to get behind them to do maintenance on them. You have to get behind them to replace a part or do something or another. And so sometimes they're very close to the wall. And if you're an enlisted guy who's a very, very short, small, not very, thin guy, congratulations, your job is to climb behind the consoles. You'll get to do a lot of that. But as a general rule, you want to have that stuff out enough that you can get behind it and do maintenance on it. And so, like, you look at the DDG, everything is back away from the wall. Those walls are all painted dark. And so the sort of usable space in the room ends at the consoles. But if you look, you can clearly get behind there, and there's clearly like a 3 feet behind that stuff. It's just not used, other than, that's the place where you put the buffer. If you've got a mop and bucket that you keep in the space, that's where you put it. That's just sort of general storage place down there. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, CIC is always dark and well air conditioned. I've only been in one CIC that wasn't well air conditioned. That was USS Vincennes. She was about 8 months away from being decommissioned, and as a result, she wasn't very well. She had lost one of her air conditioning units, her HVAC units for CIC, and she was a little bit warmer than any other CIC I've been in. It was sort of like a normal room temperature as opposed to freezing. I mean, I literally in the Combat Direction Center, the undersea warfare module on Carl Vinson one time, they had a thermometer up on the wall, like one of those thermometers that you hang on your jacket when you go skiing. It was just sort of taped up on the wall, and it said 49 degrees in the space. And I can believe it. I was the only one not wearing a coat. I had a long sleeve shirt on, the sleeves rolled down, but I was just always so excited to be at sea that the adrenaline kept me warm. But every other CIC I've been in is really, really, really freezing. I mean, other than that one on Vincennes, they're all, the warm ones are around 60 degrees, it seems. Okay, let's see. Scrolling. Okay, hello, Donnie. Scrolling. Yeah, Bob says looks extremely cool, but it looks more like Honor Harrington CIC. I suspect that was the Japanese frigate CIC that he was talking about, and I would kind of agree with that. We've actually, Bu9 has done some illustrations for Honorverse CICs. They haven't been published yet, but Tom Pope has worked on that. I don't think he thinks they're quite ready for prime time yet, but I'll try to light a fire under him. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, the French one does look like a science fiction starship bridge. I totally agree. Totally agree. So if you want to see, in addition to just being able to look at CIC pictures, if you look at the last ship that took place in an Arleigh Burke's ship, the interesting thing about that is the CIC is generally okay. Haven't really watched that show much. I've looked at some pictures of their CIC. Seem to be relatively well proportioned. They seem to have everything where they wanted to, but they put in walls and they made it look a lot neater. They made it look like it was something designed in the 21st century as opposed to something designed in the 1980s or earlier. I mean, all the naval stuff like that. There's some cool technology in there, but there's also a lot of just gray painted metal and duct work. And I always say that ships are built out of corners, conduits, and I can't remember the third one. Corners, conduits, and something else. Something else starting with C, because you see like exposed wires and stuff all over the place, and that's intentional, right? They do that intentionally because there was a time period where they would hide all that stuff behind like drop ceilings and stuff like that. But the thing is, if you're doing damage control, you need to be able to see that. You need to be able to go, okay, that's where the problem is. It's right there. I can see it. That thing's leaking. I can see it. And so it used to be the case that we started putting in all sorts of false ceilings, and we got rid of all that stuff. The only place I ever saw a false ceiling like that, any place on a Navy ship, is in the wardroom. They have a tendency to have something like that, and they've got regular. It kind of looks like office panel fluorescent lighting and stuff like that. That's the only place I've ever seen that sort of stuff. You go on foreign warships, they have that stuff all the time. Like you see pictures of a Russian warship, and you go down the hallway, and they might have wood paneling and stuff like that. On a U.S. warship, you've got bare metal, well, painted metal, and then you've got all sorts of gear there. There'll be fire extinguishers. There's axes. There's backboards in case they have to carry somebody out on a backboard. There's stretchers. There's places where there are just big wooden beams in case they have to shore something up. There's tool kits. There's all sorts of stuff. It's just all along the passageway so that you've got your emergency gear right there if you need it. In Star Trek, you've got a bunch of that stuff too. It's all hidden behind panels. We see that in the movie. It's all there. It's all hidden behind panels. Incidentally, if you had ever done Star Trek The Experience, and you actually go up and look at some of the panels in the Federation sections, they've all got there's words there. There's labels. All the labels are jokes, and they were all ones that they'd actually pulled off of actual Star Trek sets, because there's a lot of things where you just need something that looks like words, but you're never going to do a close-up of it, and so it just needs to look good at a distance. And so a lot of those things were jokes. Okay, let me scroll a little bit more, see if there's anything else. Yeah, Wright mentions stellar cartography, and I love stellar cartography in the next gen movies. I like the entire idea of being able to go and sort of do that thing. And you'll notice they added that sort of functionality into Voyager. They created that as sort of a way to look at the big picture. I would assume that any exploration vessel would have that, and I would assume that would be way more useful than having a blank screen out in front of me. I'd much rather have a display tank like that where I can sort of adjust things and take a look at the 3D dimensional stuff. I don't want a window. I want to be able to see the relative position of all that stuff. Okay, scrolling. Yeah, Rob Davidoff says that on the big screen when playing Artemis, I almost always call up the tactical plot on the main screen. I do the same thing. I could care less about looking out the window. I want to see the tactical plot. Okay. Yes, Wright mentioned something about the Spy 1D. Spy 1D is cool. Okay. Yeah, Rob Davidoff mentions Glenn Stewart's Starship Mage series. I have not made my morale roll on that. Everybody I know says, no, get over the mages stuff. It's okay. Go do it. It's worthwhile. It's on the list. I just haven't gotten around to doing it yet. In part because there's enough books in that series now that I always assume that I'm going to get hooked on something and it's going to be a major investment. So if there's 10 books in the series, I don't start until I'm ready to do a 10-book series. And so that's actually one of the reasons why I was so late actually reading all the Honorverse books I bought. I was letting David sort of get a few out because it was clear he was starting a series. And next thing I knew, there were 27 books and a new one coming out every 6 months, and I was way behind. But eventually I got caught up. Let's see. Lots of good information from Rob on Glenn Stewart's series. Yeah, since on a warship, the Matrix is a major part of how they fight the ship. The Matrix space is the bridge. If you go back to Legends of the Rangers, right? The Babylon 5 pilot that didn't get picked up. Legends of the Rangers has the tactical officer going into a room where she's doing like kung fu kicks and stuff like that to fire the weapons. And I thought that was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen when that happened. But then I saw the second Matrix movie, and that's what that space should have looked like, right? It shouldn't have been kung fu, blah blah blah, the fire weapons. It should have been, remember when they come to Zion the first time and the controllers are there, and the controllers in sort of the 3D space, and they're just like tapping, you've got the holographic display and they're tapping on the things in the display. That's what the tactical officer in Legend of the Rangers should have been doing. She should have been like, her job is to make officer level decisions about what the combat fire looks like. And so she's prioritizing targets. So she's this one, then this one, then this one. No interrupt. It's such. Okay. On second thought, that one's more important now, et cetera, et cetera. And so she should be prioritizing all the targets, and that's what that process should have looked like. I can't recall anybody actually doing that there's got to be somebody that's done it like that, but I don't remember seeing it on the screen anyway. Okay. Wright mentions the Ayatollah class, the DD993, aka the Kid class. There was a set. They took the Spruance class destroyer was really an anti-submarine warfare platform. The Iranians wanted to buy an anti-air platform, sort of a more general all-around warship based on the Spruance hull. So we designed the shipyard designed a class of 4 ships specifically on a Spruance hull that had that expanded capabilities, had a good air search fit and could fire a standard missile, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Ayatollah came in, and we didn't sell them the ships. So they had these 4 relatively good ships, and we just commissioned them in the U.S. Navy as the Kid class, aka the Ayatollah class. I believe we eventually ended up giving all of them to Taiwan, or we gave like 2 of them to Taiwan and stripped the others for parts or something like that. I don't remember whether they're even out yet at this point. So Stephen Ryder asks, why do they keep CIC so cold? And the answer is, it's all about keeping the machinery cold, because there's a lot of computer gear in there. Some of that computer gear, these days, none of it's, it's all digital, but there was a time period where a lot of that stuff was vacuum tubes. There's a lot of stuff in there that make a lot of heat, or at least used to make a lot of heat. And so it was all about keeping the equipment cold. And the reason why it's a raised floor is not only because there's wiring cabling underneath it. Cables, conduits, and corners. Cables was the one I couldn't think of. It's not just the cabling, it's because there's also piping down there. Because a lot of the gear, it's less true now, but a lot of that gear is still water cooled. And so they've got pipes going underneath, etc. And so there are places where you can like pull up the floorboard and turn a valve if you've taken damage and there's a leak. So chill water runs through there. So yeah, Stephen Ross says computers don't like heat. Rob, oh, you're convincing me I need to go read this series, and I don't have time. Okay, I'm scrolling down. Yeah, Stephen Ross mentions the Netrunner scenes from the Tech War series. I didn't really watch Tech War, so yeah, I can't say that I'm familiar with that. So, all right, everybody. So it is 11:05. I went over just a tiny little bit, but you know, in the overall scheme of things, this is almost the equivalent of finishing early, wouldn't you say, Lissa? Lissa's nodding. So, all right, everybody. So thank you very much. Pat will be here next week. The Nebulous guy will be here next week. I'm sorry, I keep calling him the Nebulous guy. Pat told me his name. I totally lost lock on his name. He's got a name. He actually has a name. He's not just the Nebulous guy. So he's with the plan, as I understand it, is that he's going to join us next week. We still need to figure out that because we've never actually had somebody. Every guest we've had, or as a general rule, when we've had guests, you know, I've been there with them. So this will be a little bit unique to have somebody on separately. The exception, of course, was Rob and TJ. So, and thanks again to them for their excellent series. And I'm looking forward to TJ coming back and doing another round on admirals in Starfleet. So he's working on that. So, and with that, I think it's time to call it a night. So thank you very, very much, everybody. See you next week.